Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I will provide a short history of position limits in futures markets, including the bona fide hedge exemption from these limits. Since 1936, the Commodity Exchange Act has directed the CFTC to establish such limits on trading as it finds, quote, are necessary to diminish, eliminate, or prevent, unquote, the undue burdens on interstate commerce that result from excessive speculation in those commodities. After the passage of the 1936 Act, the Commission set position limits for wheat and other grains. Later, the Commission established position limits for cotton and several other agricultural commodities. Over the next several decades, for some of the commodity futures that were not traded on federally regulated futures markets, such as the livestock commodities, the exchanges set their own position limits. In 1974, the CFTC was created and its jurisdiction expanded to include not just futures contracts for the commodities listed in the CEA, but for futures contracts for any commodity. In 1981, the Commission adopted a rule to require the exchanges to establish position limits for commodities that were not already subject to Commission-set limits. Prior to 1993, the Commission used several criteria to establish the levels of the single-month and all-month combined limits. These included the breadth and liquidity of the cash market, the financial exposure of traders in the event of limit price moves, and the extent to which limits would constrain trading. In 1993, the Commission adopted by rule an open interest formula for determining position limits. This is the basic formula that is in the proposal being discussed today, as Steve will describe. The Commission also permitted exchanges to establish position limits based upon the open interest formula. In 1992, the CFTC granted an exemption from the position limit requirement to permit the CME, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, to use position accountability instead of fixed limits for several of its financial contracts. Position accountability levels were not fixed limits, but rather levels that would trigger a review of a trader's position and allow the exchange to either prevent a trader from increasing its position or force a reduction in position. 6 months later, the CFTC determined it would also grant requests to permit position accountability to be used for highly liquid energy and metals contracts. In 1999, the Commission issued a rule that formally recognized the practice of position accountability in months other than the spot month. The Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000 statutorily authorized the use of position accountability. The CFMA did not alter, however, the Commission's mandate or authority in Section 4A to establish position limits as it finds are necessary. Since 1936, Congress has stated that position limits should not apply to the use of the futures markets by commodity producers or users to discover prices or manage their price risks. Section 4A originally defined a bona fide hedge transaction to mean sales or purchases of futures contracts that were offset by purchases or sales of the same cash commodity. In 1974, the Congress repealed the statutory definition and gave the CFTC discretion to define what constituted bona fide hedging, provided that its definition permits commercial users of the commodity, quote, to hedge their legitimate anticipated business needs. In 1977, the Commission codified the definition of a bona fide hedge transaction in Regulation 1.3Z, which remains in place today. In 1987, the CFTC clarified that the bona fide hedge exemption should apply not just to firms using futures contracts to reduce their exposures to risks in the cash market, but could also include balance sheet and trading strategies that are risk-reducing. Several months later, the CFTC interpreted its definition of bona fide hedging transactions to permit exchanges to grant exemptions for various risk management transactions. It also required that applicants be typically engaged in the buying, selling, or holding of cash market instruments, and that the exchanges monitor the use of these exemptions to ensure there were no market disruptions from large positions. In 1991, the Commission staff granted a bona fide hedge exemption to a swap dealer who was seeking to manage its price risk resulting from swaps it planned to enter into with investors seeking exposure to commodity indexes. Similar hedge exemptions were subsequently granted to other swap dealers. The first position limits for energy commodities were imposed by the New York Mercantile Exchange, NYMEX, when trading in crude oil began in 1983. In 1984, the Commission imposed position limits on heating oil and gasoline, and in 1990 on natural gas. In 1997, the Commission approved increases in the speculative position limits for crude oil based upon the open interest formula. The chart that we're showing now is the NYMEX all-month combined position limits. You can see from the chart the initial limits on crude oil were set in 1983 for crude oil, in 1984 for gasoline and heating oil, and in 1990 the first position limits were established on natural gas. You can see a number of times the crude oil, the all-month combined limits were increased for crude oil. They were increased for natural gas, which is the green line there as well, and gasoline and heating oil were increased in, I believe, 1991, but remained constant through the 1990s. The last two increases in crude oil and the last increase on natural gas were based upon the open interest formula that I mentioned that Steve will describe in more detail. You see that the line also ends in 2001. These NYMEX position limits. In 2001, NYMEX certified to the Commission that it would be using position accountability for the single month and all month combined limits rather than the fixed position limits, and that was consistent with the designated contract market core principles in the Commodity Futures Modernization Act and prior CFTC regulations on that. So the last levels of position limits became the new accountability levels in 2001. Thank you.